He was young, powerful, and feared long before he learned how to trust. As a Korean Mafia boss, his life had been shaped by betrayal, violence, and survival rather than affection or loyalty. Every decision he made was calculated, every emotion carefully buried beneath layers of control. He had built his empire by relying only on himself, believing that attachment was a weakness and trust an invitation to destruction. The world around him revolved around obedience and fear, not understanding or warmth. Despite his wealth and influence, his life was empty of genuine connection. Nights passed in silence, surrounded by luxury that felt cold and lifeless. People approached him with greed in their eyes or fear in their voices, never sincerity. Over time, he convinced himself that this isolation was necessary, that loneliness was the price of power. Love, he believed, had no place in a life where enemies waited for even the smallest crack in his armor. He had seen what caring could do to powerful men. He had watched them fall, grow careless, lose everything. So he hardened his heart early, choosing control over comfort, dominance over vulnerability. In his world, emotions were liabilities, and trust was something he could not afford. Or so he believed until fate prepared to challenge everything he thought he knew. At first, it was supposed to be nothing more than a practical decision. He needed someone reliable for a discreet job, someone outside his usual circle, untouched by the criminal world he ruled. He wanted no complications, no emotional entanglements, only efficiency and silence. That was when she entered his life, not as a temptation or a promise, but as a solution to a problem he wanted solved quickly. She was young, black, and quietly determined, carrying herself with a dignity shaped by hardship rather than privilege. Life had never offered her shortcuts. Every step forward had been earned through effort, patience, and resilience. She accepted the job not out of curiosity about him, but because she needed the work. To her, it was simply an opportunity, one task that could ease the weight she carried for herself and those who depended on her. From the beginning, something about her unsettled him. Not because she tried to impress him, but because she didn't. She showed respect without fear, confidence without arrogance. Where others lowered their eyes or spoke carefully, she remained calm, composed, and honest. He noticed how she listened more than she spoke, how her silence wasn't emptiness but thoughtfulness. It was unfamiliar territory for a man accustomed to being surrounded by noise and obedience. As days passed, he found himself observing small details he had never cared about before: the way she took her responsibilities seriously, the way she refused shortcuts, the quiet strength in how she carried herself even when circumstances were difficult. Without realizing it, he began to trust her presence. Not fully, not consciously, but enough to let his guard down in subtle ways he had never allowed before. What began as a single job slowly became something else. He started adjusting schedules to keep her involved longer than necessary, justifying it with logic while ignoring the real reason. Her presence brought an unexpected sense of calm to his rigid, dangerous world. For the first time in years, his life felt slightly less heavy, though he didn't yet understand why. He told himself it was temporary, that once the job was finished, everything would return to normal. But deep down, something had already shifted. The job may have been professional, but the impact was personal, and neither of them yet realized how deeply it would change the course of their lives. Over time, the distance between them began to fade in ways neither of them expected. What started as professional reliance quietly transformed into emotional awareness, built not on dramatic moments but on consistency. He began to trust her judgment without questioning it, relying on her presence as something steady in a world that was constantly shifting beneath his feet. Trust, for him, had always been a weakness, something others used against him, but with her, it felt strangely safe. She, too, sensed the change. At first, she tried to ignore it, reminding herself that her role in his life was temporary and defined. She knew the risks of becoming emotionally involved with a man like him, a powerful Korean figure whose life carried shadows she did not fully understand. Yet the more she observed him, the more she realized there was another side to him, one rarely seen and carefully hidden. Beneath the control and authority was a man shaped by loss, responsibility, and loneliness. He began to show small, almost invisible signs of vulnerability. Decisions were explained instead of commanded. Silence became comfortable rather than tense. He listened when she spoke, not as a superior but as someone who valued her perspective. These changes were subtle but meaningful. They revealed a man learning, slowly, how to let someone stand beside him instead of beneath him. For her, the shift was equally unsettling. She found herself thinking about him even when he wasn't present, wondering about the weight he carried alone. She admired his discipline, his intelligence, and the way he protected those under his care, even if the methods were harsh. Against her better judgment, affection began to take root, not the reckless kind, but a careful, growing warmth that frightened her with its depth. Neither spoke of what was forming between them. There was too much at stake: power, danger, and the fragile balance they had built. Yet unspoken emotions filled the spaces between them, growing heavier with each passing day. What once felt like coincidence now felt inevitable, as though two very different lives were being drawn together by forces neither could fully control. Trust had already crossed into something deeper. Respect had quietly transformed into attachment. And although neither was ready to admit it, love was no longer a distant possibility. It was becoming an undeniable presence. Waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored, her presence began to reshape his world in ways he had never anticipated. She did not demand space or attention, yet somehow she occupied both. In a life governed by structure and control, she became the quiet constant he did not know he needed. His world had always been sharp-edged, fast-moving, and unforgiving, but her influence softened its corners without weakening its strength. He noticed how his routines subtly changed around her. Decisions once made in isolation now carried an unspoken consideration of how they might affect her. It wasn't deliberate at first. It was instinctive. He found himself valuing her peace, her safety, and even her emotional balance in a way that felt foreign. She did not intrude into his authority, nor did she challenge it directly, yet her values began to quietly coexist with his power. For her, stepping into his world was never easy. She was aware of the danger that surrounded him, aware that proximity to someone like him could erase everything she had worked for. Yet she stayed grounded, refusing to be intimidated or dazzled by wealth and influence. She carried herself with a grace that came from self-respect rather than privilege, and that authenticity stood out sharply in a world built on fear and illusion. What surprised him most was how natural her presence felt. There was no pretense, no manipulation. She did not seek to change him, nor did she ask for promises. She simply existed as herself, honest, composed, and resilient, and that alone began to influence him more deeply than any demand ever could. He started to realize that strength did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived quietly and stayed. The contrast between them only made the bond stronger. He was shaped by darkness and responsibility. She was shaped by endurance and hope. Together, without naming it, they created a balance neither had known before. His world felt less hollow with her in it, less dominated by silence and pressure. Hers felt safer, steadier, as if standing near him gave her the space to breathe. Without realizing it, he had allowed her into places no one else had entered, not just physical spaces, but emotional ones. She had become more than an employee or a passing presence. She was now part of the rhythm of his life, a reminder that even the most carefully guarded worlds can be changed by the arrival of someone who was never meant to stay. But somehow by the time he recognized what was happening, it was already too late to reverse. Her presence had woven itself into his existence, not forcefully, but completely. And in that quiet transformation, he understood that some changes do not arrive with chaos, they arrive with calm, and they alter everything forever. For years, his emotional walls had been unmovable, reinforced by discipline and fear. They existed for a reason: to protect him from betrayal, from weakness, from the pain of losing control. Yet her steady presence began to test those defenses, not through confrontation, but through quiet consistency. She did not push against his boundaries. Instead, she stood just close enough that the walls no longer felt necessary. He found himself reacting differently to situations that once triggered anger or detachment. Where he had been ruthless, he became reflective. Where he had once closed doors without hesitation, he now paused. The change unsettled him. It forced him to confront the possibility that the armor he wore so proudly might no longer fit the man he was becoming. Strength, he was beginning to learn, did not always require isolation. At times, he tried to pull back, reminding himself of the danger she represented simply by existing in his world. He told himself that caring would only complicate things, that emotions would cloud judgment and invite disaster. But each attempt to distance himself felt unnatural, like denying a truth that had already taken root. The walls he tried to reinforce only revealed how fragile they had become. She noticed the shift as well, though she never commented on it. She saw it in the way his attention lingered, in the way his decisions softened at their edges. She sensed that he was fighting something within himself, and rather than exploiting it, she respected the struggle. Her patience, her restraint, and her empathy became the quiet force that weakened his defenses further. What cracked him most was the realization that he wanted her to stay not because he needed her skills or her loyalty, but because life felt fuller with her presence. That admission frightened him more than any threat from his enemies. Wanting someone meant risking loss, and loss was something he had shaped his entire life to avoid. Yet even with fear pressing down on him, he did not rebuild the walls. Instead, he allowed the cracks to remain. Through them came light, doubt, hope, and emotion, things he had denied himself for far too long. In letting those walls weaken, he was not losing control. He was learning, slowly and painfully, that opening his heart did not make him weak. It made him human. The love that formed between them did not arrive suddenly or demand recognition. It grew quietly, almost invisibly, settling into the spaces they shared without ever announcing itself. It was built in moments of mutual understanding, in the calm that followed chaos, and in the unspoken assurance that neither had to pretend when they were near each other. For a man who had always equated love with danger, this gentle, steady feeling was both unfamiliar and unsettling. He never spoke of it, but he felt it in the way her presence grounded him. His world, once defined by urgency and constant alertness, began to slow when she was near. The tension he carried for years loosened, replaced by a sense of balance he had never known. She became the one person who did not want anything from him except honesty. That alone made her more precious than any alliance or power he had built. For her, love was just as silent, but no less powerful. She understood the risks of caring for someone whose life was surrounded by shadows, yet her heart chose him anyway. She did not fall for his wealth or authority, but for the man he rarely allowed anyone to see, the one capable of restraint, loyalty, and deep, unexpressed emotion. She saw his struggle and respected it, never demanding more than he was ready to give. Their bond strengthened without promises or declarations. Trust flowed naturally, built on consistency rather than words. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's silences. Even without touch or confession, intimacy existed in how they anticipated one another, how they protected each other without being asked. It was a love shaped by patience, not urgency. What made it most dangerous was how real it felt. There was no illusion, and despite the fear that lingered beneath the surface, neither of them turned away. In that quiet growth, love transformed them both. It did not weaken him, it steadied him. It did not distract her, it gave her purpose. Without ever naming it, they had already chosen each other, building something enduring in silence, unaware that this unspoken love would soon be tested by forces far beyond their control. The moment his priorities shifted, the past began to stir. A life built on control never truly forgets when its ruler changes course. Old alliances, unfinished rivalries, and buried grudges sensed the shift long before it was spoken aloud. The man who once acted without hesitation was now careful, deliberate, and that alone was enough to draw attention from those who thrived on instability. His past was not something that stayed behind when doors closed. It followed him quietly, embedded in decisions he had once made without mercy. Enemies he believed were long neutralized began to test boundaries. Movements became less predictable. Information traveled faster than it should have. He recognized the signs immediately. Someone was watching, waiting for proof that he had something to lose. And he did. For the first time, danger did not feel distant or abstract. It was no longer about territory or reputation. It was personal. The knowledge that his past could reach her filled him with a cold, steady dread. He understood the rules of his world better than anyone caring gave his enemies leverage, and leverage invited violence. The realization forced him to confront the cost of the life he had lived before she entered it. He became more guarded, not with her, but with the world around them. Every choice was weighed with new seriousness. Where once he accepted consequences as part of power, he now rejected risks that could place her in harm's way. The past demanded payment, and he was determined that she would not be the one to pay it. She sensed the tension, even without understanding its full source. His demeanor grew more alert, his silence heavier. Yet she did not retreat. Instead, she remained steady, refusing to let fear define her presence. Her quiet strength only deepened his resolve, reminding him that she was not a weakness, but she was the one thing he could not afford to lose. The shadows of his former life closed in, forcing him to acknowledge an unavoidable truth. Love does not exist in isolation. It challenges everything around it. The past was no longer just a memory, it was a threat, and facing it would require more than power. It would require sacrifice, courage, and the willingness to finally confront what he had once been, in order to protect what he was becoming. Eventually, the pressure of his two worlds became impossible to ignore. The life he had built on power demanded complete loyalty, ruthless decisions, and emotional detachment. It offered security through dominance, but at the cost of everything human. For years, he had accepted that cost without question. Power had given him control, respect, and survival. Love, on the other hand, asked for something far more dangerous: change. He understood what choosing love would mean. It would require restraint where brutality once came easily. It would demand transparency in a world ruled by secrecy. Most of all, it would force him to risk everything he had spent his life building. Power had always protected him from loss, but now it was power itself that threatened the one thing he could not replace. The choice weighed heavily on him because it was not simple. Walking away from his empire did not guarantee peace, nor did holding onto it guarantee safety. Yet one truth became painfully clear. No amount of authority could shield her if he remained exactly who he had always been. The world he ruled would eventually reach her, no matter how carefully. He tried to keep her apart from it. For the first time, he questioned the purpose of everything he had achieved. What was an empire worth if it left him alone? What was control worth if it destroyed the only connection that made him feel alive? These questions haunted him, forcing him to confront the possibility that power without love was just another form of emptiness. She never asked him to choose. That, more than anything, made the decision unavoidable. Her strength lay in her independence, her refusal to manipulate or demand. She believed he would do what was right, even if it meant losing her. That belief challenged him more deeply than fear ever could. In the quiet struggle between ambition and affection, he realized that love was not asking him to become weak, it was asking him to become responsible. Choosing love did not mean abandoning strength. It meant redefining it. And with that understanding, he began to accept that the greatest risk he could take was not letting go of power, but holding onto it at the cost of the only future that truly mattered. As the weight of his decision settled, he began to see her not as someone he needed to protect from his world, but as someone who steadied him within it. Her strength was quiet yet unyielding, shaped by years of standing on her own without leaning on anyone else. She had never been dependent on his power, his wealth, or his influence, and that independence became the very thing that grounded him when everything else felt uncertain. She faced fear without dramatizing it and uncertainty without surrendering to it. Where others might have been intimidated by his world, she remained composed, choosing courage over comfort. Her resilience reminded him that survival did not always require dominance. Sometimes it required endurance, integrity, and the courage to remain true to oneself even when surrounded by darkness. In moments when doubt threatened to overwhelm him, her presence acted as balance. She did not push him forward or pull him back. She simply stood beside him, unwavering. That steadiness became his anchor. Knowing she believed in his ability to choose differently strengthened his resolve more than any threat ever could. For the first time, he was not making decisions alone. He began to understand that love was not about rescue or sacrifice alone, it was about partnership. She did not need him to save her, and he no longer needed to rule alone. Together, they created a space where strength was shared rather than enforced, where trust replaced fear as the foundation of connection. Her influence did not weaken him, it sharpened him. It gave his choices clarity and his future direction. Through her, he learned that true stability did not come from control, but from mutual respect and unwavering support. In anchoring him, she did not tie him down, she gave him the courage to move forward with purpose, no longer driven solely by power, but guided by something far stronger. What began as a simple agreement, limited in time and intention, slowly transformed into something permanent and unshakable. The job that once defined the boundaries between them no longer mattered. Its purpose had been fulfilled the moment their lives intertwined in ways neither could undo. What remained was not obligation, but choice, a decision made daily to stay, to grow, and to face the future together. He did not erase his past, nor did he pretend it held no consequences. Instead, he learned how to reshape his life around what truly mattered. Power was no longer the center of his existence. It became a tool rather than a destination. The man who once measured success through control and fear now measured it through stability, protection, and the quiet certainty that he was building something lasting. For her, the journey required courage of a different kind. Choosing him meant accepting a life that would never be simple, but she stepped into it without losing herself. She retained her independence, her principles, and her strength, refusing to become small in the presence of his world. Rather than standing behind him, she stood beside him, equal in resolve and purpose. Together, they created a future that neither had imagined possible. Love did not remove danger, but it gave them reason to confront it. Trust did not come from promises, but from consistency and shared sacrifice. What bound them was not the memory of how they began, but the vision of who they were becoming. The job that brought them together faded into insignificance, remembered only as the starting point of a lifetime. In choosing each other, they rewrote their destinies, proving that even in a world shaped by shadows, love can endure, evolve, and define a legacy far greater than power ever could.